Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast. I'm Ollie Barrett, live from London, and these are the headlines. French President Emmanuel Macron beats rival and far-right leader Marine Le Pen, winning a second term in office with over 58% of the vote. Russia announces a ceasefire around the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol to allow a civilian evacuation from the industrial area that is the last site of Ukrainian resistance in the port city. Israel Defense Forces launched retaliatory artillery fire after claiming a rocket was fired into northern Israeli territory from Lebanon. The European Commission Chief and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi agreed to launch an EU-India Trade and Technology Council, a first of its kind for India. Stock markets and oil prices sink on growing concern that lockdowns in China, aimed at fighting a worsening COVID outbreak, could further harm a world economy battling high inflation. Russia has announced a ceasefire around the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. The Defense Ministry says it will allow a civilian evacuation from the industrial area that's been sheltering the remaining Ukrainian resistance in the city. Russia says its troops will unilaterally stop any hostilities, withdraw units to a safe distance, and ensure the withdrawal of civilians. The ministry has told the Ukrainian side to show readiness to start humanitarian evacuations by raising white flags at Azovstal. Last week, Russia said it had gained full control of the strategic eastern Ukrainian city, except for its huge Azovstal industrial area. Russian President Vladimir Putin had ordered a blockade of the steelworks, where hundreds of civilians are reportedly sheltering with Ukrainian troops.
Vive la République et vive la France!
Emmanuel Macron has become the first French president in 2 decades to win a second term. Projections at the close of voting showed Macron gaining over 58% of the vote to Marine Le Pen's 41%. That's much narrower than in 2017, when it was 66 to 34. Speaking to a crowd in front of the Eiffel Tower, Macron said the victory was for a more independent France and a stronger Europe.
Nous impose de considérer toutes les difficultés. Mes chers compatriotes, c'est avec ambition et bienveillance pour notre pays, pour nous tous, que je veux pouvoir, à vos côtés, aborder les 5 années qui viennent. Cette ère nouvelle ne sera pas la continuité du quinquennat qui s'achève, mais l'invention collective d'une méthode refondée pour 5 années de mieux, au service de notre pays. Je sais aussi que nombre de nos compatriotes ont voté ce jour pour moi, non pour soutenir les idées que je porte, mais pour faire barrage à celles de l'extrême droite. Et je veux ici les remercier et leur dire que j'ai conscience que ce vote m'oblige pour les années à venir. Je suis dépositaire de leur sens du devoir, de leur attachement à la République et du respect des différences qui se sont exprimées ces dernières semaines.
The far-right candidate conceded defeat in her third attempt to become president, but she bitterly criticised what she called the brutal and violent methods of Emmanuel Macron. Le Pen is vowing to fight on to secure a large number of representatives in legislative elections coming up in June.
Je crains ce soir que le quinquennat qui s'ouvre ne rompra pas avec les pratiques méprisantes et brutales du précédent et qu'Emmanuel Macron ne fera rien pour réparer les fractures qui divisent notre pays et font souffrir nos compatriotes. Alors oui, pour éviter cet accaparement des pouvoirs par quelques-uns, plus que jamais, je poursuivrai mon engagement pour la France et les Français avec l'énergie, la persévérance et l'affection que vous me connaissez.
Well, we can go live to Paris now and speak to our correspondent, Rosie Burchard, who's joining me now. Rosie, what's top of Emmanuel Macron's intrigue after this victory?
Well, the decision has been made, Ollie. Emmanuel Macron is keeping the keys to the Elysee Palace. I was there in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower last night here in Paris when his supporters spilled out. They were celebrating, they were jubilant, but of course, Ollie, that's just one side of the story. Many people here in France are disappointed, either disappointed with the choice they were presented with between Macron and far-right challenger Le Pen, or disappointed because they supported Marine Le Pen and she, of course, increased her vote share. So moving forward, the next big challenge for Emmanuel Macron will be trying to unite this very polarised and divided country. And the first test we'll have for that is those legislative elections coming up in a few weeks' time. Emmanuel Macron will be campaigning with his party, La République en Marche, or the Republic on the Move, but so will his challenger, Marine Le Pen, and also those traditional parties that were simply decimated in the first round of these presidential elections. Now, if Macron does not succeed in securing a majority in that legislative house, or at least a workable, not enough seats to secure a workable coalition, he will not be able to advance with his policy goals, most notably making good on promises to better tackle the climate crisis and his goal to reform France's labyrinthine pension system, which will be no easy feat. That is not a popular policy here, so a very difficult road ahead for Emmanuel Macron trying to unite this country, which is a country divided.
And Rosie, what about a little bit further ahead? Because there's inevitably going to be speculation about who will contest the next election, given that Emmanuel Macron can't.
Emmanuel Macron cannot. Marine Le Pen could, although it seems now, her having tried 3 times, that she might give way for another member of her party. But of course, she having secured the largest ever vote share for her party, the National Rally, we can imagine that those ideologies and those ideas that the party represents are not going away. Now, Macron so far does not seem to have trained up any successor, anyone within his government or his party that could be seen so far as a potential leader for France in the future. However, we have a couple of more years to come, and that might be something high on his mind. But Ollie, let's not forget that just 5 years ago, the first time Macron was elected, he was an entirely new kid on the block. He started a new party and swept into power. So that just gives you a sense of how quickly the landscape, the political landscape here in France, can change. We might see entirely different parties and candidates coming in a few years' time. But of course, what we will likely not see is a total different change of those ideas that are represented. The far right having gained 41 to 42% of the votes in this round of the presidential elections, and Macron's pro-business centrist party gaining 58% on his ticket for the presidential election. So a lot of uncertainty here, and of course 5 years to go for Macron to try and prove himself and prove his party and his centrist ideology.
And Rosie, what about the reaction from Brussels, the European Union? Is it a huge sigh of relief that it's Macron and not Le Pen?
Ollie, that sigh of relief was almost audible all the way from Brussels here in Paris. For the EU, a Le Pen presidency, some analysts suggest, would have simply been a death knell for the bloc. Le Pen is famous for her Eurosceptic views. She wanted to essentially tear up the treaties that write the foundations of the European Union, despite the fact that she had softened her stance and revoked what she had previously advocated for, which was France leaving the European Union. But in Brussels, we also have that other big institution, NATO, and France, of course, a key member of that defensive alliance, amid a war in Ukraine. Now, Emmanuel Macron seems to have taken a bit of a step back from that diplomatic track over the last couple of weeks as he focuses his eyes on the domestic scene. But we do expect now he's going to make some sort of diplomatic comeback. We might, for example, see him appear in Kiev in the coming days. And most importantly, with that war raging on, Ukraine has been calling for tougher EU sanctions on Moscow. This Macron victory might just be the key to unlocking some of that deadlock within the European Union on how to proceed on sanctions, most notably on whether to introduce an embargo on Russian oil. The EU countries continue to buy, many of them, energy from Russia on a daily basis, and Ukraine says they are simply then helping Russia finance that war.
Okay, Rosie, merci. That's Rosie Burchard reporting live from Paris. Next, Lebanon, which is also gearing up for an election that is now less than a month away. It comes as the country is going through an economic crisis.
Lebanon is going to polls this May, but will the polls change the future of the crisis-hit nation? To understand that, we need to look at Lebanon's population. Lebanon is home to both Christians and Muslims. Both communities are further divided into religious subgroups, the largest being Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, a political makeup that has plagued the country ever since. The protests in 2019 were a sign of how people were done with the political class. We spoke to Judd Gon, a journalist who had announced his candidacy. But why is he running for the elections?
Okay, why did you choose to run for elections? Is there any hope for change, or is it a protest to the political deadlock?
It's both a protest to the political deadlock and trying to push for the hope, because it's not a conclusion having a hope or not. It's a decision. We should have hope because we should do something. Is the whole deadlock that we are facing going to be solved through elections? No, it's a struggle. In a long-term struggle, you have to pass through elections, and you can use it as a platform to talk to people, to try to convince people in a different path, and that's what we are trying to do.
After the civil war in Lebanon, Lebanon's leaders came together. They signed the Taif Agreement. This divided the government among the sects. The president should be a Maronite. The prime minister is a Sunni. The speaker of the parliament must be a Shia. While it was meant to transition the country into a post-war situation, what it did was allow the conflict to persist in Lebanon. The politicians separated their portions of the government, using the money to enrich themselves and their political class.
To the global viewer, what's going to change? Why is this election crucial, and why are the French, the Americans, why is the whole world is talking about the upcoming elections in Lebanon? Why?
It's trying to have what happened in 17th of October demonstration, have it more focused, and trying to politicize the popular anger, to try to direct it to a way that we hope and we wish and we believe that it's the path to solve our problem, which is a systemic problem and not just a mere changing a couple of people in government by others. The alternative is the alternative of a political system that is inefficient.
These elections are particularly crucial. They need it for aid and to show the world. And to show the world there is a way forward for Lebanon. For many, it is a sign of hope. Others, it is a sign of a looming disaster.
What are you running for? You're running for capital control? You're running for IMF? Tell us.
The difference in our economic approach to how to solve the crisis is first of all, on restructuring the whole economical body of interest in the country, and not just having a plan for the financial sector, not just to distribute losses, but to have an economy that is self-sufficient and that can, when having to distribute losses, distributing these losses not from an accountable approach, just having all of the largest depositors carrying most of the burden, that's self-evident, but more on having the capitals of the productive sectors preserved through the banking sector. And in order to have such an approach be feasible in the future, one should have the fight carried on facing the banking sector, who are refusing any burden to be carried by them, and the official political and economic stance of the government and the central bank.
China is going through its worst COVID-19 outbreak in 2 years. After a spike in Shanghai cases and deaths, Beijing is now reporting a rise in infections. Beijing residents have been snapping up food and supplies as the city begins mass testing of all residents. There are growing fears of a Shanghai-style lockdown in the capital city. Global stock markets have been under pressure in Monday trading. Shares in Hong Kong and mainland China plunged amidst growing fears about the effect of the COVID outbreak on China's economy. The Shanghai Composite Index shed 5.13%, while the Shenzhen Composite Index on China's second exchange dived over 6%. Moving on to Pakistan, which has successfully struck a deal with the International Monetary Fund to extend a stalled bailout program. The existing loan size will increase from $6 billion to $8 billion, and reports suggest the IMF program will now be extended by another 9 months to 1 year. A delegation from the International Monetary Fund will visit Pakistan next month to discuss issues regarding the subsidies being given by the government on petrol and electricity. And this is something the Imran Khan government wasn't able to pull off. Our correspondent Susan Tarani's been speaking with Pakistan's new finance minister to get a sense of what happened behind closed doors.
Minister Ismail, thank you so much for joining us on WION.
Thank you.
So the International Monetary Fund has set out 5 major conditions for the revival of $6 billion of bailout. It's a package for Pakistan, including the reversal of fuel subsidies, which now we know that you seem to agree with. So if this condition is enforced, do you think you'll be able to provide the relief needed for the people of Pakistan if these subsidies are removed?
Thank you so much for having me on your program. I think that it's very important for Pakistan to put back in the IMF program. We've spent the last 2.5 years on this program where the IMF was able to disperse $3 billion to us. And the other $3 billion were going to come to us in the next 6 months. So to give up this program just now when it was backloaded and we're about to get more funds will make no sense for us. Also, we have some difficulty in raising funds right now and selling our Eurobonds right now in this very difficult market. So it's very important that we have our multilateral partners. I look forward to welcoming the IMF mission in Pakistan. And one of the points of discussions with the IMF has been their point about reversing these subsidies that were given by the last government in the last month of its government. These are a very large drain on the government of Pakistan, a drain large enough that we cannot sustain. And the amount of money we have to borrow to pay these subsidies is so large that it just crowds out all private investments, and the deficit also fuels inflation. So in order to actually provide real relief to the people, we will not distort prices, pass on, in a gradual manner, the real price of fuel and to the people, and then try to control inflation by cutting down on government deficits.
You speak about inflation, and you've actually listed inflation as one of Pakistan's major economic challenges. Has your government started taking steps in easing pressure for the Pakistani people when it comes to inflation? You also mentioned job creation as well, but I think inflation was on the top of your list.
At this point, inflation is at the top of the agenda of my boss, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and of our political party. And we really want to bring the inflation down. That has caused a lot of hardship to the people of Pakistan. And the Prime Minister has already decided and has instructed the Pakistani Government Corporation, Utility Stores Corporation, which has stores that sells, relatively inexpensive commodities, groceries and all that, to sell sugar, rice, sugar, wheat and edible oil at a cheaper price. Edible oil, I think, at almost about 40% discount to the market, and sugar about 15% discount to the market. Wheat also about 15% discount to the market. So that is a targeted subsidy to the very poor. And whereas we understand that the policies of the previous government cannot be overturned in a day, and the policies of the previous government will have effect on prices, and so we are going to continue to have inflation over the next 2-3 months before our policies start to kick in and we try to control them.
Mr. Minister, your former finance minister, Ishaq Dar, had suggested that all financial institutions should be contacted. And on the one hand, you say that the previous government really accumulated a lot of debt, and you were against that. But a lot of debt borrowing as well. Are you perhaps concerned that this government is going on the same track?
The deficit in PTI's years have been more than 3,500 billion, more than double of the deficits that we did. So obviously they've accumulated a lot of debt, and what we need to do is to try to, and this is what I said, that tighten our belts and try to not spend money we don't have. We will try to have both a vigorous program of revenue collection without raising any rates. I'm going to try and collect revenues, and I'm going to show them that how we can actually, a Muslim League government can increase tax revenues without raising rates.
Minister Ismail, thank you so much for joining us on WION.
Thank you.
Ukrainians have been marking Orthodox Easter amid conflict in their country, breaking the centuries-old tradition of midnight services. Thanks for watching. Do stay tuned to WION. I'm Ollie Barrett, and we'll leave you with that story.
Ukrainians flock to churches to mark what they call the Great Day. Their centuries-old tradition of midnight Easter services got abandoned over fears of Russian shelling and curfew.
Yes, it is actually surprising that it has been quiet today. Quiet enough. There were a couple of times that these noises were heard relatively close to our Svetlaya street, where it is usually loud, but it was somewhere far away, maybe in the Heroes of Labour area. And now, from the very morning and night, in general, you hear silence, suspicious, even I would say, honestly.
This is the Georgia Peremotsia Church in Severnaya Saltovka suburb, one of the most shelled areas in Kharkiv. A small group of people marked the religious holiday quietly with the rector of the church. This church has an underground section, shelter for dozens of locals too frightened to stay in their own homes or have lost their houses to heavy shelling.
At the beginning it flew there nearby. The explosion occurred there, blew the windows. Now some 2 weeks ago, a shell landed about 1.5 meters away from the church. There was more destruction. The windows all broke. Well, not all of them, but most of them on that side.
Worshippers also gathered at St. Vladimir Church, meters away from a damaged tram stop. Shattered glass and debris still seen on the ground. In another part of the city, a large group gathered outside the Archangel Michael Church. The faithful sang as a priest blessed him with baskets of decorated eggs and pascha, and splashed them with holy water. The service inside the church saw the archpriest pray for Ukrainian soldiers defending the country on the front lines. Meanwhile, an army chaplain conducted a service for Ukrainian soldiers in the Kharkiv region. Amid shelling, this has intensified in recent weeks. Bureau Report, WION. World is one.
This is right, Arab.